While you've been watching this video, America's national debt grew by roughly $40,000. Not this year, not today, right now while you're watching. The total right now, $39.8 trillion. Stack that many $1 bills on top of each other, and they'd reach the moon and come back more than 8 times over. So can the United States actually pay this back? And if it can't, what happens next to the government, to the dollar, and to you? Let's break it down. As of this month, the US Treasury's own numbers put the total debt at $39.8 trillion. Back in January of this year, it was $38.5 trillion. That's over $1 trillion added in about 6 months. Split evenly, that's about $118,000 for every single American citizen, man, woman, and child. Per taxpayer, the share climbs even higher, roughly $284,000 each. To put that in perspective, $39.8 trillion is larger than the entire yearly economic output of China, larger than Japan and Germany's economies combined. It's a debt bigger than most countries' entire economies. And it isn't slowing down. On average, the debt has been growing by more than $1 billion a day. At that pace, the government adds a full $1 trillion roughly every 2 years. Not all of this debt is owed to outsiders. About 80%, nearly $32 trillion, is held by the public, investors, banks, pension funds, foreign governments. The remaining 20%, the government essentially owes to itself through funds like Social Security. Rewind to 1980, and the entire national debt was under $1 trillion. Today's number is almost 40 times larger. So how exactly did we get from there to here? That's not a 5-year story, or even a 20-year story. It's a story that stretches across nearly every presidency of the last 5 decades, through booms, wars, crises, and a pandemic. Let's walk through it. In the 1980s, sweeping tax cuts combined with a major defense buildup during the Cold War. Revenue fell just as spending rose, and the debt began its modern climb, crossing $1 trillion for the first time. There was one brief exception. In the late 1990s, a booming economy and spending restraint actually produced budget surpluses for a few years, proof that the trajectory isn't fixed in stone, but it didn't last. The 2000s brought 2 long wars and major tax cuts. Then in 2008, the financial system nearly collapsed. To stop it, the government spent and borrowed on a massive scale, bank bailouts, stimulus packages, the debt climbing sharply. For most of the 2010s, interest rates stayed near zero. That made borrowing feel almost free. The debt kept growing, but the cost of carrying it barely did. That would not last forever. Then came 2020. To keep the economy from collapsing during the pandemic, the government approved roughly $5 trillion in emergency spending in under 2 years, the single fastest debt increase in modern American history. All that spending, combined with global supply shocks, pushed inflation to its highest level in 40 years. To fight it, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively, from near zero to well above 3.5%. Underneath all of this sits a slower, quieter driver. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid now make up roughly 2/3 of the entire federal budget. As the population ages, that share only grows, year after year, automatically. And here's the part that surprises people. This debt has grown under Republican and Democratic administrations alike for over 40 straight years. It isn't really a story about one party. It's a structural one. The underlying pattern is simple. Almost every year, the government spends more than it collects in taxes. That gap, the deficit, gets covered by borrowing. Do that for decades and the debt compounds. This year alone, the federal deficit is projected at close to $1.9 trillion, nearly 6% of the entire US economy, added to the pile in a single 12 months. But spending and deficits are only half the story. The other half is the bill that comes due every single year, just to keep the lights on, the interest. And that bill is now spiraling in a way most Americans don't realize. This year, the US government will pay roughly $1 trillion just in interest. Not new spending, not a new program, simply the cost of servicing debt that already exists. To put that number in context, America now spends more on interest payments alone than on its entire national defense budget. Interest has quietly become the government's second largest expense, behind only Social Security. Why now? Because the average interest rate the government pays across all its debt has climbed to around 3.4%, more than double what it was just 5 years ago. Government forecasters project this will only get worse. Over the next 10 years, interest payments alone are expected to total $16.2 trillion, doubling from about $1 trillion a year today to over $2 trillion a year by 2036. The projected milestones are striking. By 2028, interest is expected to exceed Medicare spending. By By 2038, it overtakes the entire defense and non-defense discretionary budget combined. By 2048, interest becomes the single largest line item in the federal budget, bigger than anything else. Zoom out far enough, and by 2056, annual interest costs could reach $6.6 trillion, nearly 7% of the entire economy. That's a 500% increase from where we stand today. Here's the trap: when interest payments get this large, the government often has to borrow more money, just to pay the interest on money it already borrowed. It's debt, quietly financing more debt. Every dollar spent servicing old debt is a dollar that can't go toward infrastructure, education, or research, the very investments that grow a country's future economy. Economists call this crowding out, and it's already happening. So who is actually collecting all this interest? Who does America owe this money to in the first place? The answer might surprise you. Roughly 80% of the debt, about $32 trillion, is held by the public. That's a broad category: everyday investors, banks, mutual funds, pension funds, state governments, the Federal Reserve, and foreign governments. The remaining 20%, nearly $8 trillion, is money the government owes to itself, mainly through the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. In a real sense, your own retirement system is one of the biggest lenders here. Among foreign holders, two countries have historically stood out as the largest: Japan and China. For decades, both parked huge sums of their trade surpluses into US Treasury bonds, seen as one of the safest investments on Earth. That picture is shifting. Multiple reports over the past year suggest China's central bank has been quietly trimming its treasury holdings while increasing gold purchases, part of a broader, gradual move to reduce reliance on the dollar system. Why does this matter? If big buyers pull back, the Treasury has to offer higher interest rates to attract new lenders, which pushes borrowing costs up even further. It's a feedback loop. Less demand can mean a bigger bill. Domestically, the Federal Reserve matters just as much. In late July 2026, it held its benchmark rate steady between 3.5% and 3.75%, a decision that directly shapes how expensive it is for the government itself to borrow. So, a debt this large, growing this fast, owed to a mix of Americans and foreign governments. How does something like this actually get resolved? Economists generally point to three possible roads. Path 1: grow out of it. If the economy expands faster than the debt does, the debt shrinks relative to the size of the country's income, even without cutting a single dollar of spending. This has happened before. After World War II, America's debt was even larger relative to its economy than it is today, but strong sustained growth over the following decades brought that ratio steadily down. The problem: this path needs sustained growth well above what forecasters currently expect. So far this decade, that hasn't materialized. Hopping to simply grow past the problem is not a guaranteed plan. Path 2: cut spending or raise taxes, sometimes both. Directly close the gap between what the government spends and what it collects, so it stops adding new debt every year. The problem: roughly 2/3 of the federal budget is mandatory entitlement, spending politically very difficult to touch, and tax increases carry their own, entirely separate political resistance. Neither is an easy sell. Path 3: inflate it away. If inflation runs a little hotter than interest rates over time, the real value of existing debt quietly shrinks. The government effectively pays back with cheaper dollars. The problem: this path doesn't erase the cost, it just quietly shifts it onto everyday people, through higher prices and savings that buy less over time. It's a hidden tax, not a real fix. Right now, that path doesn't appear to be the one in play. Inflation actually cooled in June 2026, and the Federal Reserve chose to hold interest rates steady rather than cut, a sign policymakers aren't rushing to inflate the debt away. In reality, most economists expect a messy blend of all three: some growth, some future spending and tax adjustments, and inflation that stays elevated but not runaway. Rarely does a country pick just one clean path. The real risk here isn't a single dramatic collapse. It's a slow squeeze, shrinking room for the next emergency, rising borrowing costs for everyone, and harder political choices with every passing year. Which raises the question everyone actually wants answered: what does any of this mean for you, personally? Higher federal borrowing costs tend to ripple outward. Mortgage rates, car loans, credit cards, small business loans, they're all connected to the same broader interest rate environment the government itself is borrowing in. Every dollar spent servicing debt is a dollar that isn't funding roads, hospitals, schools, or the next public health response. The bill doesn't disappear, it just shows up as things that quietly don't get built. By the 2030s and 2040s, as interest eats up more of the budget, lawmakers face genuinely hard choices: raise taxes, cut popular programs, or keep borrowing and hope growth eventually catches up. There is a global dimension too. America has borrowed cheaply for 80 years largely because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Sustained doubts about fiscal discipline, even gradual ones, slowly chip away at that trust over time. This isn't a story with a convenient villain from one political side. The debt has grown under both parties, across decades, which is exactly why it's been so hard to actually address. This isn't a story about imminent collapse. Economies have carried heavy debt loads before without falling apart. But it is a warning. Every year of inaction narrows the options and raises the price of fixing it later. So think back to that number ticking upward at the start of this video. It hasn't stopped. It won't stop tomorrow or next year. The real question was never if this gets addressed, it's when and how painfully. Grow faster, cut and tax harder, or quietly inflate it away. Every realistic path forward runs through one of these three roads, and likely some combination of all three. If you were in charge for a single year, what would you actually do? Cut spending, raise taxes, or bet on growth? Drop your answer in the comments. I read all of them. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe. What If Politics covers exactly this: the economics and geopolitics shaping the world, explained clearly without the noise.